though, which is
Great.
awesome.
So Evans, now I see live. So it looks like we are live at St. John's Cathedral in Denver, Colorado. Martín, welcome and good morning. We'll give it just a moment. In the Episcopal Church, we are very enlightened thinkers, and we are existentially late to events, whether online or in person. So I always like to give it a minute or two. How are you up there in Fort Collins?
Well, we're doing good. I can tell you, I designed lots of events with lots of different partners, and I always have to explain to them that we're not starting exactly at the time we're starting. We're starting 10 minutes after, and that's often a fight. So I agree with you that give people a couple minutes to get settled.
Absolutely. Episcopalians are often late, but it's also God's time. So we move by the Spirit. Did cooler winds and weather arrive this morning as it did down here in Denver?
We got pretty clear skies this morning in Fort Collins. So we got those fires pretty close by. So yesterday was not a good day in terms of the wind, but today looks a lot nicer. So.
Oh, good. Well, God bless all of you up there. It's terrifying, I know. What is the closest fire to Fort Collins?
The Cameron Peak fire. I think it's about 35, 40 miles or so. Yeah.
Well, let's begin. Good morning and welcome to everyone who is joining us for the Dean's Forum at St. John's Cathedral. I am Richard Lawson, the Dean, and I am joined by Dr. Martín Carcasson, who is a professor at Colorado State. Our topic this morning is preparing for the presidential election and this fall political season, and how we can think about all the different levels of this election as we prepare to vote, the way in which we are in incredible conflict in our country and to some degree in the world, and the way in which we can listen, as we would say from a religious perspective, to our better angels, look for ways to have empathy and perhaps even compromise with those with whom we disagree. But before we talk about all of that with Martín, let us pray. Almighty God, to whom we must account for all our powers and privileges, guide the people of the United States in the election of officials and representatives, that by faithful administration and wise laws, the rights of all may be protected and our nation be enabled to fulfill your purposes through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Martín, good morning.
Good morning.
You are in Fort Collins, where you teach at Colorado State. You are a professor in the Communications Studies Department. Your PhD is from Texas A&M, but perhaps your most significant academic background and degree comes from graduating as an 8th grader from an Episcopal school in Houston.
Yeah, St. Thomas Episcopal, yeah.
St. Thomas Episcopal. So thanks be to God for the way in which St. Thomas Episcopal shaped your mind and your soul, I hope. How, any quick memories of St. Thomas, academically or otherwise?
It had a pretty big Scottish tradition. So my kids certainly love the pictures of me in kilts doing the Irish jig and those type of things. We had a world-renowned Scottish band that a lot of those memories go back to that, certainly. I wasn't in the band though. So.
That's really funny.
A lot of bagpipes.
A lot of bagpipes, but we have bagpipers who show up every now and then at the cathedral, as you might imagine. Well, welcome. Martín, you and I had a great and long conversation this week about our respective fields in this election. And one of the things that you and I talked a lot about is I have this assumption for this series. We have a lot of people from the cathedral tuning in. We have a lot of people from literally God knows where tuning in. And I know that one of my assumptions for this series is that there are people of goodwill across the political spectrum. So one of our goals, I know that you share, is pitching this series to the broadest spectrum possible. How do you think about that as a teacher and then someone joining us in this forum today?
Yeah, no, certainly. I think that's a lot of what my work is dedicated on is that assumption that most people can be reasonable. Most people, can certainly be part of these broader kind of democratic processes. So, above all, I'm a process person. That I try to design processes to help people come together across perspective, and have the conversations they need to have to deal with our shared problems. And I believe, in my experience, the last 14 years running these events, has shown that with a good process, people can have these conversations, right? So I think a lot of the polarization that we're having, while in some ways is worse than it's ever have, and it's a serious problem, is an exaggeration.
Oh, I look forward to hearing more about that. I hope it is an exaggeration, but we shall see. So let's dive in. So I know that one of the images that you use, it's a kind of metaphor, is wicked problems. It seems like the political dysfunction and disagreement, as well as the injustices that we will talk about in this country, particularly related to race and white supremacy, all of the above are wicked problems. What is a wicked problem by your definition?
Yeah, I mean, there's a broad literature about it, and a lot of it kind of creates categories of types of problems, which can be useful. But I mainly kind of look at wicked problems more like a lens through which to see problems. This idea that if you're facing a difficult problem, you can step back and say, if I look at this as a wicked problem, how does that change how we see it? How does that hopefully give us ways to talk about the issue differently, right? So for me, a wicked problem is primarily defined by kind of competing positive underlining values that don't fit together very well, right? So we want to do something, but we can't get more of something that we want without also getting more of something we don't want, or getting rid of something we want to keep. And a lot of this goes to a lot of the problems with how our brains are wired. We tend to want to see simple kind of problems, right? We want to see things in terms of, I've got good values and the people that disagree with me have bad values. And that's what fuels a lot of this polarization, because we're making assumptions about other people's motives. But when we look at problems from a wicked problems perspective, we see all the different reasons or interests or values underlining an issue, and recognize there's lots of different ways of organizing those. And good people can rank those in different ways. And all of a sudden that sparks a very different kind of conversation. Right? One way to think about this is a lot of my work is shifting from the easy assumption that problems are always caused by wicked people, and putting the wickedness in the problem, and see what kind of conversation that might spark.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Wicked problems, not wicked people.
No. And it's not the assumption that doing this in a Christian perspective, right, is interesting in a sense, but it's not that people aren't wicked, or there's no wicked people in a sense. It's trying to avoid the easy assumption of the good is on my side and the bad is on their side. Because once we make that assumption, once we make the assumption of negative motives on the other side, that shuts down all conversation, right? And it shuts down, a lot of important aspects of human nature in terms of creativity and problem solving, because we don't have to solve the problem. All we have to do is vanquish evil. All we have to do is make sure the other side doesn't win, right? So we shift the conversation, all of a sudden we're opening up lots more possibilities for solving our shared problems together.
So that's really interesting to me for a lot of different reasons. Permit me to do just a quick sketch of some Episcopal and Church of England and Reformation history that very much so relates to what you're talking about in a very different context. In the 16th century, the Church of England was born out of the English Reformation. And one of the things that I've been taught by a particular theologian, and that I particularly agree with, is that the Church of England and the English Reformation for Anglicanism and for the Episcopal Church was in origin a social compromise, a social compact, more so than a theological compact. So if you think about Elizabeth I and her incredible generosity as a queen, shepherding the Church of England, she didn't split theological hairs. She was fine if someone was, say, very Catholic on one side or very Protestant on the other, or just sort of more moderate theologically. And she and the bishops at the time, particularly Archbishop Cranmer, created a book of common prayer that had just plenty of ambiguity and plenty of room for all the different sides or positions on the spectrum. And that was really beginning with a social community, a social compact that created a lot of space for different perspectives. It was not primarily about, say, creedal agreement or sacramental agreement, the nature of Christ and the Eucharist, say. Where I think that relates is to where we are or could be today, where I wish we could get, is the Episcopal Church strives to be a via media, this kind of compromising place where people of different perspectives can find a home, theological or political perspectives. How do you think that today politically it seems like there's less room or less of a confident voice for the moderate middle? Or a sharper way to put it in light of that 16th century church history is there's less room for various sorts of perspectives. Is there less compromise and less roominess today?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, going back again to the sense of human nature, right? I mean, I think our natural tendencies is to seek out kind of the simple story, to seek out, to avoid nuance, to avoid ambiguity. Some of the things that you talked about, that isn't natural to us, right? That being said, we can build up kind of the habits and a culture, an organization, or a community to be more comfortable with uncertainty, more comfortable in seeking out nuance. So that's a lot of the work that we try to do is create processes that instead of kind of triggering the worst of human nature of wanting kind of things simple and wanting it adversarial, and for each to kind of be in our teams, that we become more comfortable with that and we can have these broader conversations. So organizations and institutes that are able to do that are explicitly working to kind of bring people together across perspective, and because once we get to know each other as people, it's a lot harder to demonize each other. It's a lot harder to kind of make those simple assumptions about other people's motives. So that's why I was excited to do this work with y'all, because a lot of my work talks about the importance of bridging institutions that are created explicitly to try to kind of bring people together, to have a broad range of perspectives and help people kind of work through those and understand each other. There's a lot of things that bring us together, and there's a lot of things that divide us. So to get back to your question, right now, the things that are dividing us are much stronger than they've ever had. And so many things that used to bring us together have kind of lost a lot of their power in some ways, or even, something like sport, which used to always bring us together, now all of a sudden is also a kind of a thing, that contention and thing that kind of brings anger in a lot of ways. So that's where, there's a lot of work in political science where, we've always had a two-party system, but it used to work very differently. It used to work in some ways more like a four-party system, because you had kind of conservative Democrats and you had more moderate Republicans, and so it incentivized compromise in some ways. It incentivized working together and connection. Last 20 years, for a wide variety of reasons, that kind of changed, and we now have two parties that are completely separate. And what that does, so much of our political discussion is driven by that national kind of political frame, which for me, in some ways, I introduce myself as I design processes that are, explicitly designed to help people come together and have tough conversations. I would argue our national political system is almost the exact opposite. It almost seems designed to bring out the worst in us and to frame things in very simple ways. And then on top of that, elections, especially winner take all elections, are the exact same thing, right? So we're right now, for these next 2 months, the ratio of things that bring us together and the things that divide us apart are going to be probably at its worst, The good news again is we're not nearly as divided, right? These are structures, these are institutions that are taking some differences and expanding them and exaggerating them. So the more we do these kind of things, the more we have bridging institutions that can push back on that, the more we can deal with that kind of polarization.
So you just made me feel a little bit guilty, because I am a huge Denver Nuggets fan, our NBA team here, and we just tragically lost to the LA Lakers. And there was a moment in a game this past week after the game, because basically their star players, if they just fall down, even if we're not even around them, they get a foul call because they're LA. And I found myself saying, I hate LA. So I'm going to try that might be harder for me to stop saying that than it is to try to have empathy for my people that I disagree with politically. But I'll work on that. More importantly, sketch really quickly what those four different parts, what used to be four different parts of what we now know as two political parties are. Just
well, I mean, there's wonderful charts out there that you can see in terms of like the people that are in Congress or the Senate or whatever, how conservative or progressive they are, right? And it used to be kind of like overlapping charts, right? So if you looked at the Democrats and the Republicans, there was quite a few Democrats that were more conservative than a group of Republicans and vice versa, right? So you kind of had four wings or two wings of each party. And often the conservative Democrats would work with Republicans and vice versa.
Right.
So it wasn't, it just didn't inherently trigger those simple kind of adversarial tendencies. Again, our brains are, we're wired to be groupish, right? We're wired to be in teams or,
right.
We hear tribalism a lot, kind of in the popular culture there. So we're tapping into that kind of negative human nature more than ever now with a strict two-party system. Now, you've used the word compromise quite a bit, right? Generally in politics, compromise is not a positive word anymore, right? Compromise is read more as giving in, right? Of aiding the enemy in the worst kind of framing in a sense. So we've lost a critical part of our politics because of the overall dominance now of a two-party system, which is completely split. And very little overlap within that.
Very helpful. Thank you. Let me say to everyone who's viewing, we will have a Q&A at the end of this session. And if you have a question for Martín or for myself, if you would go ahead and put it in the chat. Of course, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, the navigation bar at the bottom, you will see, actually Q&A, I apologize. Put it in the Q&A, type your question, and I will be sure to ask it of Martín. Martín, I know that you also think about conflict and this polarization in relationship to the brain. Would you say a bit about that?
Yeah, no, I did quite a bit of work maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I kind of did this deep dive into a lot of the social psychology research and brain science to primarily to understand like why are we so polarized? Why, because as a process person, I'm again trying to design processes to bring out the best in people. So trying to kind of learn how the brain works so then I can design processes based on that. And a lot of what I heard, unfortunately, or learned from that is our brains are in some ways wired for polarization, right? Our brains, we strongly prefer consistency and certainty, right? So our brains, once we make a decision, our brains work overtime to defend that decision and kind of protect it. We like to see things. We are very much narrative creatures, right? We think and we remember and we organize information in terms of stories, and in a basic kind of archetypal story of good versus evil with a hero and a victim and a villain. Those are basic things across all cultures, across all times of how we think. And once we have a strong narrative in our head, once we've decided who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, whether that's red versus blue or whatever it may be kind of politically, our brains are really good at getting any kind of new information to fit within that existing narrative rather than allowing new information to challenge that narrative, right? And that's why we're seeing all the struggling kind of with the role of facts, right? There's a great report, the Rain Institution did a report talking about truth decay, right? That really kind of digs into why does information not work the way it used to, right? And a lot of that is because our brains interpret and make sense of information from those perspectives in a sense. So when you have a two-party system with winner-take-all elections, which really kind of reward that kind of thinking, and reward politicians that focus, frame everything in terms of these adversarial things, that takes those natural tendencies of human nature and makes them worse, right? Now the good news is,
give us some good news, because that's
that's
fascinating and terrifying, right?
Yeah.
Because it seems to, it relates to nature versus nurture, and how far are we genetically, or in terms of evolution, are we locked into these habits of disagreement and ultimately of violence?
Yeah, it's the last framing of the bad news is, as a communication professor who, and I was trained in argumentation, right? So I was trained on how do people make arguments and provide reasons and evidence and logic and all that kind of stuff. But we have a political system in some ways that consistently rewards really bad arguments and punishes good ones, right? And we've got difficult enough issues already to deal with without that kind of layered on top, right? But the good news is, while all those negative tendencies of human nature are easier to trigger, they're more basic. They're not all we have, right? So there's a lot of positive aspects of human nature that we can possibly tap into, and we're seeing the people that are doing the work that I'm doing of designing these processes to bring people together to explicitly get away from kind of an adversarial framing of things, to ask questions in different ways, to have small groups with a facilitator that allows people to think out loud and get beyond just the one time at a microphone. All of a sudden we're tapping into natural human empathy, right? Especially face to face, talking to someone, hearing their story, right? Seeing their facial reactions really helps rehumanize people, really helps undermine those negative assumptions about the other side. Probably the most important thing is humans are just naturally creative problem solvers. The sad thing is our politics rarely taps into that notion, right? Because if all problems are caused by bad people, we don't have to be creative. We just have to get rid of those people, right? But then once we've shifted the wickedness from the people to the problem, and instead of face to face against each other, we're shoulder to shoulder working a problem, we're tapping into all these good parts, right? And then probably most importantly, generally we're social, we're groupish, right? But that can be adjusted in a lot of fascinating ways, right? So humans are naturally think in terms of us versus them, but who's the us can always be changed. So some of the worst things humans have ever done is when we define that us versus them and dehumanize them and did horrible things. Some of the best things humans have ever done is when we broaden that notion of us, right? So that's where a lot of our process is. How do we kind of shift things so the us is bigger? A lot of my work shifted from national because the us versus them is red versus blue or Republican versus Democrat, and it's just sparking all that adversarial stuff. But when we shift to a local level, we can reframe that. So we're talking about Fort Collins, we're talking about Northern Colorado, and we quickly recognize that there's a lot of things that we agree on, and those that we disagree on are typically much more manageable, and we can work together to kind of address those.
Very helpful. And just for those who are interested in making a connection with that very subject, with theology, one Anglican Episcopal theologian is named Sarah Coakley, who has worked on this very subject. And she has worked with a colleague at Harvard named Martin Nowick. And they've just recently, in 2013, published a book that is titled Evolution, Games, and God, the Principle of Cooperation.
Nice.
That is Evolution, Games, and God, the Principle of Cooperation. And one of Coakley's important, and her colleagues' important arguments is that the brain has evolved in such a way that cooperation, empathy, compromise, these virtues that you and I are talking about, are actually a significant portion of how we've evolved. Yes, there's still fight or flight, but we wouldn't be in the place that we are, the good parts of the place that we are, without cooperation and empathy. So it's an interesting, and Coakley brings a theological lens to that some of our people might find interesting.
Playing off that a little bit, part of this story about us being groupish, right, or being social, or our brains wired for teams, is we're not that individualistic, right? We're not, and if you look at survival of the fittest or whatever, it's not the most fit individual survived. It's the cooperative individual that had a strong group that survived, right? So that further kind of that notions of the importance of compromise is a critical aspect of human nature. The tension is, how do we get the positive of that, the positive of the us, without the negative of the them, right? And that's the ongoing tension that we have to figure out better to all live together.
Absolutely. So let me shift us, and we have a question from Jenny Creasy that relates to how you and I can shift just a bit. Jenny is a parishioner who also named this temptation of fight versus flight. And she's asking if you have any concrete tools that we can use to consciously shift into that more cooperative part of our brain. You are the founder of something called, of a nonprofit, the Center for Public Deliberation. And part of the goal of that center is tapping into that part of the brain. You are you teach at Colorado State, but you are a wonderful example of a professor who is not just simply at home in the academy, but really believes that your research relates to the rest of the world. So as the founder of this center, you find yourself in classrooms, civic organizations, with people of all ages and certainly of all different perspectives. From that work, we've been talking about brain. From that work, can you think of an example in which you witnessed someone change his or her or their mind? Being in a situation, say someone who was really in a definite ideological perspective, but coming out of a better process, changed their mind.
Yeah. Now, I was thinking about this question for the last few days, and one way I'll start kind of answering it is, I think sometimes changing your mind is seen as too big of a move, right? We often kind of think, and when things are polarized, when things are, only two sides, we think of changing your mind as, I used to believe we need to build a wall, and now I don't, right? That we've flipped completely. And that's pretty hard to do, right? A lot of what we try to do, because we're trying to reframe things from the beginning, that it's not just two sides, right? That there's a spectrum, that there's lots of possibilities of dealing with things. So we have lots of examples in the work that we do. We have these beautiful moments that my students share with me. So I train undergraduate students as facilitators. So we run these events for the city and school districts and community organizations to try to create a different way of talking to each other. And most of these are small group facilitated discussions that are creating a different atmosphere. But we have these moments all the time where my students, people don't change their minds that much, but they change their minds about the people they disagree with, right? So there's this aha moment that when they're listening to someone they disagree with, and instead of having that simple caricature of their perspective in their head, they're hearing them give that perspective of why something's important to them. And they're like, oh, like, that's why you think that way. That makes sense to me, right? I still think you're wrong, right? But now you make sense, right? I'm seeing where you're coming from. And that's what really opens up possibility kind of for working together, right? So that's the biggest, we don't see people flip their perspective so much. We see people change their perspective about how the other people think. And that's a huge move for democracy, because that switches the people that I disagree with from being an opponent to being a potential collaborator, right? So now all of a sudden I can work with that person. What they think is important is also important to me, right? Maybe not as important as what I was thinking of, but now all of a sudden we're trying to, how do we deal with all these things that we care about, right? Versus me framing it as I care about something and they don't, right? Or they reject that thing, right?
That's really good. And it reminds me, just very quickly, I'll say it, Martín, there's the theological architect of Elizabeth I's more political vision for the Church of England in the 16th century was named Richard Hooker. And the prayer for his feast day speaks of this larger kind of unity that you're talking about, and being for the church to be a kind of bridge, not for the sake of compromise, but for the sake of comprehension. And it's this comprehensiveness that's not sort of not just mere compromise, but a kind of appreciation, a kind of humility that sees in the other some wisdom that we can benefit from as well.
No, one of the, I train my students to be facilitators, like I mentioned, and one of the basic kind of notions or responsibilities of a facilitator is to help groups develop mutual comprehension, right? That notion of understanding, people's perspectives and why they hold them, which, often people that are walking in the room for those conversations have their blinders on, right? They see things from their perspectives. They have simple assumptions the other side. So we have, the earlier question about, tangible things that we do. We have lots of different things that we do at our meetings. How we talk about the meeting, how we're framing the question in the beginning. I often talk a little bit about wicked problems from the front of the room. We have briefing materials or background material that's framed in a specific way. Then we have small groups. Then we have all those things kind of work together. And a big part of that, we have to get to the point that there's enough mutual comprehension that get away from those simple assumptions. So then people can really start doing the hard work of working on problems together.
So Janet Poley asks a really important question and an interesting, provocative question in relation to that. Janet writes, to many of us, President Trump is so wicked that nothing he says is worthy of cooperation. Please comment.
Yeah, no, I mean, Trump has been an interesting, a lot of my work is bringing sides together, and a lot of my work is bringing conservatives and progressives together. Trump's a difficult situation because one way to think about Trump from my perspective is Trump really understands the human nature, and Trump is really good at adversarial politics. So he's been able to take advantage of the overall system in terms of being a two-party system, and he knows what works to fire people up. So I struggle with Trump in some ways in terms of bringing people together across perspectives, because the tactics that he's using, for me, are things we should be avoiding. Right? He's really good at tapping into these how we think in terms of simple narratives and so forth. That being said, I'll agree with the statement that it is also because of a two-party system got to that point that the anti-Trump side sees everything through that lens, right? So it makes any kind of compromise, any kind of move even more difficult in a way, right? I do overall kind of see Trump more as a symptom of the overall system, right? That rewards those kind of tactics in a sense. So I push back sometimes when people put all the blame on Trump for why we're so divided, right? It's more Trump was someone who just happens to be able to take advantage of how the system is kind of set up in terms, instead of rather him being the one that caused all this.
I would have to think a lot more about if I completely agree with that last point that you just made, how much he is symptom versus cause. That's another conversation. But the point you're making dovetails nicely with the professor, Dr. McCellum, Dr. Jessica McCellum, we had last week, talked about how, and her view is international politics. And she framed this election and Trump, and going back to Obama, in a pattern of pendulum swings. And she spoke about it in relation to how, in terms of the international perspective on this election and the United States, how the instability of our of where we stand as a country, and how therefore trustworthy we are to our allies and to the rest of the world. Interesting. I wish we had more time for all of that. Very quickly, if you'll say, and then I want to shift to an urgent question that is raised by Ray Stransky, another member of the parish. But before we do that, just very quickly, Amanda Barker asked, do you think can you say a little bit about the relationship between comprehensiveness and empathy?
Yeah, no, I saw that question. I guess I'd have to think a little bit more in terms of literature, but my quick kind of top of the mind answer, I see mutual comprehension more as a kind of intellectual exercise, right? Like I'm understanding where you're coming from, and you know where I'm coming from. So you're judging my positions based on the actual reasons or the actual beliefs I have instead of an assumption. Whereas I see empathy as much more of a physical kind of a reaction, right? More of an emotional kind of thing, connection. One of the most fascinating questions we're dealing with right now, I've always made the argument that our meetings, which are small group, face to face, taps into kind of positive human empathy in a way that other mechanisms can't, right? And certainly social media, when people, especially people, are hiding behind avatars and not real names, that's going to bring out the worst in us, right? Whereas talking to people face to face and seeing their facial reactions brings out something positive in us. So the question, does Zoom do that, right? Because we are face to face here in some ways. I can see our facial reactions. So are we still able to tap into that human empathy? But I do think, so yeah, I'll leave it at that. But I see them certainly connected, because if you have, I think you have to overcome the simple assumptions, intellectual assumptions about someone's position. So you have to have mutual comprehension for empathy to really kick in. Maybe that's one way that they're connected.
Very interesting. So I want to pick up on a very difficult and urgent question that Ray Stransky is asking: how these principles relate to a subject such as Nazi Germany. But I want to sharpen Ray's question, or relate it, apply Ray's question to something that's more urgent and relevant today. But same question. As the dean of the cathedral here, I have on a number of occasions, because I've had too many opportunities to address the subject of an unarmed, usually Black male, being shot or murdered by police. And we've just had, just so many more examples of which we're aware of racism and white supremacy in our culture in the last year. I'm certain that there aren't more examples of that. We're just more aware, in part because more things are being videoed on phones. And I found myself, Martín, one day during announcements saying, off the cuff, unprepared, extemporaneously. And as you know, Episcopal priests aren't often that sort of extemporaneous. White supremacy is an evil, and there's just no room. It will destroy the soul of this country, this world, and it will destroy an individual soul. So how do you, with white supremacy or racism, when that comes up in these situations, that seems to be an area where these ideals of moderation, of comprehensiveness, of empathy, something else is called for.
Yeah, no, I certainly, a big part of my work is bringing people together across perspectives and trying to reach out to a very broad range of positions, both in we do a lot of work before our events to make sure voices are heard in our materials that people are reacting to. And we do a lot of work of trying to get a very broad audience. But that all being said, it's pretty easy for me to say that white supremacists are outside those bounds, right? I'm not going to seek out and make sure that position is represented. Overall, I talk a lot about that. My positionality, I'm impartial to the issue, right? I don't have a dog in the fight of the meetings that I'm designing. I'm designing these meetings to elevate the conversations and help us kind of come up with better solutions. So while I'm impartial or nonpartisan on the issue, I'm actually partisan towards democracy, right? I'm an activist in terms of democracy, and basic tenets of democracy is just a basic respect of other people and those type of things. And white supremacy violates that, right? So yeah, there are certainly limits in a sense of where we're going to go, in a sense, to make sure voices are being heard, and there's some voices there that aren't sufficiently kind of tied to the ideals of democracy that can be left out and should be called out.
Very helpful. Thank you. Let's see if we can knock out one or two of these questions in the chat very quickly, because I want to get to our last question before we break. What can be done to encourage from Barbara, a more balanced reading of history to create a better understanding of both political sides? We've talked about that to a degree, in relationship to that example from the Church of England, the question provides a part of the answer, which is a better reading of history.
Yep.
If we're more aware of our history, it gives us more self-awareness and I think intelligence today to make better decisions. How would you respond quickly to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, going back to the very beginning in terms of wicked problems, right? When you read history from that lens, you're not looking for easy solutions. You're not looking to define who was right or wrong. You're looking for the tensions, right? You're looking for where are those where we've had to work through different sides. So then you can look at history from lots of different perspectives and see that it's valuable to you because it's giving you another perspective, another kind of way to kind of make sense of some of these ongoing kind of tensions. One point that I often make with wicked problems, I make the argument that democracy itself is a wicked problem, right? Because it's defined by competing underlying values that can't really be resolved. We care about freedom, we care about equality, we care about security, we care about justice. One at a time, those are all good things, right? But they don't fit together very well. So democracy is this ongoing process of how do we negotiate the tension between those things, and how do we make sure none of those dominates too much and none of them gets left behind. So when you're reading and engaging history from that lens of what are all the different values that we really care about, and how do they sometimes fit together, and how do they sometimes kind of go against each other. And history is kind of this ongoing process of us trying to negotiate those things.
Martín, this last anonymous question is just fascinating. And it basically, as I hear it, how do you, in the classroom or with the center, deal with questions that have to do with civil rights or Black Lives Matters, which feels like one level, and versus something that's more at the level of an opinion, say taxes or things in that nature? I love this question because for me, from a religious standpoint, I think there is plenty of room for political debate. There really are good ideas across the spectrum, but we do sometimes hit subjects that get to, I would say where our soul is at stake. And I don't mean just simply the soul of a person. I actually don't mean that. I mean the soul of the country. Who are we? And when it's something like civil rights, we're up against the transcendent. We're up against absolute meaning because if God is real and God is the maker of all people, that's a non-negotiable something. How do you deal with that tension? Do you, as a professor who's not a priest, do you feel that difference, and how would you name it?
Yeah, no. I mean, there's certainly, more broadly as a communication professor and as a process person, there's lots of different ways of bringing people together depending on the issue, right? So the heart of what I do is deliberation, which is, these interactive processes to make decisions together. Those are more the policy oriented things, right? There's other things that are much more dialogic, where the whole purpose of the meeting or the event is just to bring people together, just to kind of create some trust and understanding. We're not making decisions together. We're not ranking things. We're just being human together and listening to each other. So often that's probably a more appropriate thing. And then there's probably, I've taught social movement classes. I certainly look at protests and those type of things. There's other topics that it's not about coming together and listening to different sides, right? It's about, there still certainly is certain things that one side is right. And we more have to kind of push for that in a sense. So there's, different styles of communication and different forms of interaction, depending on the different issues. And the burden that we can put on some people to constantly have to relitigate kind of basic notions that everyone's humanity matters. We don't want to put that much, emotional labor on people sometimes, right? So that's the work sometimes that maybe isn't us getting together and having that conversation in those kind of contexts.
Really well said. So our last question, what is one final thing that you want to make sure that we talk about or hear from you on?
The heart of wicked problems is this recognition that no matter, you don't resolve wicked problems. There's not a right answer. There's no, scientists or experts can't tell us that it's this constant process of negotiating the tensions, like I talked earlier, about equality and all these different kind of things. So that leads to the point that conflict is inherent. Living together in diverse communities is going to have a significant amount of conflict and uncertainty. Uh, Most people, unfortunately, are wired to avoid conflict, right? Then there's a small percentage of people that love conflict, right? That live for the conflict, that love to be, and unfortunately, those are often our loudest voices, right? Because they see the conflict through a narrow lens, and they're very loud.
Martin, how big is that small percentage? Do you have a guess on that? Or?
Now I would probably say maybe about 15% or so that really kind of enjoy the fight, right? And love
15,
the game.
15.
And then there's even smaller percentage of people that know how to deal with conflict very well. And I think the work that we have right now is to grow that last percentage. That how can we develop both the mindsets and the skill sets of people to instead of avoiding conflict or reveling in the conflict, that know how to elevate the quality of conversations and work across people. And like I mentioned earlier, I think one of the keys to that at the local level is kind of the development and the sustaining of these bridging institutions that see part of their mission to bring people together, to create opportunities for people to have better conversations, and reconnect in important ways, and actively work against this polarization. A lot of my work is focused on shifting people from this adversarial perspective, which brings out the worst in us, to a much more collaborative perspective, which brings out the best. And we need organizations and institutions that help facilitate that shift.
If someone would like to learn more about the Center for Public Deliberation, how does one do that?
So our website is CPD, so Center for Public Deliberation.colostate.edu. So you can go there. And then my email is mcarcas, so MCARCAS at colostate.edu. And the other one, that the great kind of place to go, so the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation is this umbrella group that does tons of this kind of work. So their website's easy. It's ncdd.org. But on Tuesday morning, we're doing a free event, CBD with NCDD, looking at a whole bunch of online tools that are designed to bring people together. Most online tools are really good at dividing people or bringing like-minded people together. So these are specific tools that are being used to help people have the kind of conversations kind of we're talking about.
And if someone wants to link up on Tuesday with you, that's an open event, and how would one do that?
Yeah, that's an open Zoom event. If you go to our website, we're also on Facebook. So if someone jumps on Facebook and searches for Center of Public Deliberation, we have a page there. I think it's 11 o'clock Mountain on Tuesday. This the online engagement showcase that's just going to, a lot of specific tools on how to engage people online synchronously. So people at the same time engaging tough issues.
Martín, thank you so much. And I'm so glad that we got to talk about the Center for Public Deliberation. If anyone's interested, please link up with their website. Martín, you're a wonderful mind. You're a great soul. I've enjoyed getting to know you. We're grateful for your time. And I think your work is just not only profound, but urgent in this day and age. You take care up there in Fort Collins, you and all your colleagues and students and faculty and staff at Colorado State. Thank you, and I hope our paths cross again. For those who are attending, if you would like to worship with us, Holy Eucharist begins at 10 a.m. in 10 minutes, so grab a cup of coffee and prepare. You can find our service on our website, which is sjcathedral.org. God bless you all, and take care.